Do I qualify for maternity leave pay? How many holidays do I have left? How do I file expenses? For ops leaders tasked with delivering more for less, HR Harriet really is a silver bullet. Harriet delivers instant answers to employees on people and operational questions 24/7 across the business, eliminating unnecessary time spent on frustrating administrative tasks. Harriet is People Operations AI that makes every person in your company more productive and gives your ops and people teams their time back. Interested in increasing productivity and decreasing operational costs? Visit hrharriet.com. That's hrharriet.com and get Harriet working for you today. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Operations Room. I am Brandon Mensinga, joined by my amazing co-host Bethany Ayers. How are you on this fine morning, Bethany?
Fine morning.
Yes, I can see the light blinding you right now. So
I'm appreciating that, yeah. Because it's 18 degrees in my room, so I need a little bit of sun to make it an almost bearable temperature. How am I doing? I'm exhausted. I'm always exhausted. I feel like every time you talk to me now, now that I'm doing full-time work, basically.
I know. I'm catching you on Friday, so you've had the full work week to have its impact and toll on your psyche.
Exactly. And also the travel. I had to travel and travel and travel. So I was in Manchester Monday through Wednesday, got home Wednesday evening, and then I went to Sifted Summit yesterday, which was cool. It was day 2. Apparently day 1 was way busier. I missed day 1 because I had to be in Manchester unexpectedly. Very, very European. I would say at least a third of the attendees were from Europe. I can't think of another event I've been to in London where it's that high a concentration. And I had never really paid a huge amount of attention to Sifted before, but it actually is backed by the FT. And the main founder of it is an FT correspondent. So it had a lot of FT vibes to it. There was a lot of the salmon pink around. All of the panels were hosted by journalists, and journalists are just better interviewers. I don't know how they're better interviewers. Maybe they prepare more.
They have like an educational thing for this, do they not? Like you take 4 years of being a journalist to graduate and be a journalist.
I guess so. Maybe we need to go to journalism school.
Yeah. Ask better questions.
Very fluent questions, but yet it is quite good questions. But they all had iPads full of prep. There was this one guy on stage, a journalist, and he basically was like aggressively reading questions and moderating via his iPad and not really making eye contact. And one person had a really long answer and he was like, yeah, okay. And then just asked a question to the next person.
Total over-reliance on the tech and not paying attention to the actual. I mean, this is the point of being live, isn't it? You want eye contact. You want to respond to what they've said basically in some way that is useful for the crowd and the audience, do proper segues into the next person. So it sounds like this fellow perhaps wasn't the best at doing that.
No, he was. He just, I think, didn't like one of the guests.
Oh.
And was using his iPad. But to be fair, it was a panelist that I wasn't that keen on either, because I was just like, who is this guy? And then looked him up. He was the CEO of Improbable.
Improbable. Isn't that Libby Penn? Wasn't Libby Penn our former guest?
Oh.
The COO of Improbable. It was like the defense scenario.
Which I think was recently sold for an undisclosed amount of money. But the guy is like really arrogant and really, I know everything. And fair play to him, he has created this business. Like I'm not saying, and he is clearly bright, but like the level of arrogance is just off the charts.
Wow, that's a lot to come across in a short interview on stage, isn't it? Because most CEOs can mask their ego and their kind of master of the universe the mentality if they have it pretty well. Was there some entertaining element of it? There must have been, just watching this person in action.
Yes, because, well, also just watching the journalist not engage with him. So he would ask him a question. He would go off on his answer of how incredibly awesome he was for a very long time. And then the journalist would just be like, okay, so, and the next question to the next person. It's a smaller version of SaaStock and SaaSter in terms of everybody goes to it. I managed to go to a couple talks, but otherwise was just chatting with people. Looking at name tags, hearing things, loads of Europeans over, and just so many investors.
Nice. Okay. Yeah.
I think there were more investors than there were companies for the investors to speak with. So I'm not sure if it was a great event for them. I talked to one guy and he said that he spoke to more investors than he did anybody else. And I was like, well, that's not very good for deal flow, is it? I was presumably there for deal flow, but instead just chatting.
When you look at SaaS stock in particular, that was always a great event for SaaS where you're trying to connect scale-ups with investors to have conversations, and they have dedicated pits to allow that to occur where they do matchmaking and so on. So it sounds like Sifted is kind of like equal or comparable in that way, where there's a lot of investors about to have chats with to pitch your company in next round of funding.
It seemed to be like there were a lot of founders of very small companies and a lot of investors. Rippling was supposed to be there, the HRIS. I was getting very excited. I was like, ooh. And because it wasn't a very big expo, I was like, I've walked the expo. I haven't seen them. Look on the map. Okay, maybe I've just missed it. Go to where it is on the map, and they're not there. So clearly at some point they pulled out, but after everything was made for the event.
That kind of show, I would think, for Rippling might actually be interesting because, at your point, I mean, there's a lot of attendees that are all tech-focused and a ton of scale-ups in different forms. So we have got a great topic for today, which is lessons in leadership. What can we learn from the military? And we've got two amazing guests for this. We've got Mr. Ben Reed. He's the founder and CEO of Redeployable and has spent over 10 years in the military as part of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineering Unit. And we're also joined by Andy Wright. He is the former regional VP for Salesforce and also spent over 20 years in the military as well and is a pilot by trade. So with two amazing guests talking about military and how that applies to the business context, which I'm very excited about. Before we get to that, wanted to ask you a couple of questions, Bethany. And the first one was Andy had talked about enabling psychological safety to enable collaborative decision-making and putting everyone in a position to contribute and provide feedback and so on. And he also talked about the fact that there are times, usually emergencies, when the leader needs to make an authoritative call as to what has to happen. And he framed it up as saying, you need to build trust with the team to be able to use those trust credits, whereby on occasion you need to kind of pull rank and also make it clear expectation-wise to the group that these situations may arise and they're not going to happen often, but they may occur. So with that, I was just wondering, what do you make of that?
Like, yes.
Yes, that does happen.
It does happen. And I agree. Although I was thinking like, in the military, you're talking about like actual life and death situations. In business, you aren't. So I don't think you're dealing with things that are as urgent and as dramatic, despite the fact that in business, we often feel that way. And we like to, in some ways, pretend that what we do matters deeply. But with us in tech, if your platform's down, and you need to rectify that as quickly as possible, that is where a level of urgency and somebody needing to take control and tell everybody what to do has to happen. So I'm being unfair. Like, people might not die, but you do have an urgency that needs to be addressed. And I think it is like understanding when those true urgent moments are versus I just don't fancy having a debate. I want to make a decision. Nobody else has an opinion on this one. In my mind.
Have you ever done this? So there's been a group where you've just made a call for the group and there was blowback because of the fact that you had actually done it, but in your eyes, it was needed for whatever reason.
I haven't necessarily made a call for the group, but when I am particularly stressed and tired, I have broken psychological safety by either being dismissive of other people's ideas, possibly ridiculing ideas, or just saying, yeah, that's not going to work, but not taking the time to explain why, or shutting people down, or saying, oh, that's an interesting idea. Why don't you explain it to me? While inside I'm like, this is a stupid idea. Or ideally not saying that at all, but being like, that's not one I thought of, but maybe it could work. So if I don't have a lot of emotional bandwidth myself, I have definitely cut people down and stopped the group from gelling.
I hear you on this front because I think when you're under stress and things are amped up to some extent in your mind as to what's happening or not happening, I tend to go into overdrive a little bit. This is kind of what we need to be thinking about. Why are we not thinking of that? We need to move on to the next thing in terms of our conversation here. So I won't take the time to fully listen to what they're saying. I'll kind of get the answer, but move on to the next piece. So when I get into that mode, I have to check myself if we're going to get to a good answer, it's not because Brandon's going to drive to that answer. It has to be me guiding and shepherding the group to get the best out of the group, to get the appropriate answer that we actually need to do something useful at that point. What he had also talked about was this, which is when you're under stress, how do you self-regulate? And he had a couple answers to this, which I'm curious what you think. But he talked about the fact that when you're under stress, you should, have your close-knit group of individuals, which may be in the company or out of the company, that you can talk to kind of let off steam a little bit and also get perspective to some extent to ensure that you're either not overreaching or getting a little bit too crazed up in your approach as to what you're doing. The second one that he talked about was just understanding that you're going to make mistakes, but when you do, to put those mistakes behind you, forgive yourself and to move on. And then the last one that he talked about was the obvious, which is learning the lessons from the actual mistakes that you've made when you've been put in that situation of high stress and you've made some calls that are probably not the best for the company at that point. How do you self-regulate when you're in a stressful set of circumstances?
I think it's one of those where it's a muscle that you build in terms of awareness. And for me, all of the body work that I've done really helps because it gives me an early warning system. So I can start to notice the physiological sense of stress almost before I notice it in my mind, which gives me that little bit of extra time to notice that I'm really, really tense and let me just calm down or accept it or take a deep breath. And I guess my first thing after taking a deep breath is like, it's going to be okay. Like whatever it is, I guess similar to Andy's point of I've been through worse is this is fine. In the grand scheme of things, I'm safe. We're all safe. We're not going to be killed anytime soon.
Nobody's going to die because of this software malfunction.
Exactly. So like take a bit of a breath. And like as soon as I do that, I can even just feel myself settling in. And so that's the first point of handling stress. And then also if it's chronic stress, because I notice that it's not just like one urgent situation, because in there I can actually be a bit of adrenaline. It helps, lots of clarity, solve a problem urgently. But mostly when I get to being a bad leader, it's because of chronic stress. You're coming up on a quarter end or things are not going well and it's consistently not going well. And I'm getting a lot of pressure and then I'm not blocking that pressure. So that's when being aware of it and taking the time to just settle back down, not in that moment, but kind of before work, like before the situation, to get myself regulated again is very helpful. And then after making a mistake, that's a loop that I can get into, particularly if I'm stressed and then make a mistake. And then I'm really, really good at self-flagellation and like beating myself up about that mistake and then trying to get out of that situation. My body can just stay very tense for a very long time. And so for that, it really depends on how much stress I'm at underneath. Like if I'm at fairly low stress, have made a mistake, I can forgive myself and move on. If it's a high level, I've made a mistake, it can take me weeks to come back into a regulated state.
So that forgiveness part of it is challenging for you.
Yeah. And also, so then I end up becoming like even more afraid of making mistakes because then I don't know for how long I'm going to be out of action and in this dysregulated, uncomfortable place. I practice in a small way self-forgiveness regularly and in hopes that like when the big things happen, I can be better at forgiving myself. And then that's also where I really use my therapist. So for me, my husband, he helps me regulate. And then my therapist helps me regulate when I really need outside support to help me put it in perspective. And then just spending a lot of time embracing the fact that making mistakes is being human and making mistakes is what makes us interesting and making mistakes is what unites us. And that helps me calm down.
I think this outside counsel piece that he mentioned, I use quite frequently. So I have my tight-knit group of 4 or 5 people outside the company to shake me basically where they're like, look, Brandon, it's not the end of the world. Here's your situation. Here's a bit of the context. Here's some things to think about. Here's what I've done in the past. So getting that kind of feedback to just kind of get your boots back on the ground is extremely helpful. And then the other bit that I've always leaned on, for better or worse, is usually in the companies that I work in, we tend to have good, strong kind of heads of people, VPs of people that are very empathetic and good counsel, basically. And if I'm in a particular pickle for whatever reason, I tend to lean on that person to have conversations because obviously they have the direct context for what the situation in the company as opposed to the external counsel in that case. One last question. He talked about debriefs after they would run a sortie, I think they called it. So when they would go out and do their pilot actions, they would come back and do a debrief as to how it went. And he said they would go into a room collectively, they would close the door and no rank, and they would just go at it in terms of what actually happened, why it happened, what was good, what was bad. And as he described it, it was a brutal process. As he described it, blood on the wall as they kind of came out of these sessions. And what he said was that the psychological safety to have that open-ended conversation where whether you're the most junior person or the most senior person, you could really go at it in terms of providing clear feedback as to what had happened, what went well, what didn't go well, and so on, with the purpose and intent to get better in the next sortie that they would have. And it made me think about retros and how important they are, because clearly in the military, they deem this to be a very important activity for them to get better with their group. And equally for our companies, retros are kind of the same purpose, which is get together as a group. Hopefully there's not blood on the wall, but you're doing a real assessment of what's happened basically to inform your future, to make that future better. And I was just curious what you made of that.
I really like the concept of retros, and I agree. I think it's a great place to learn. I have never succeeded in embedding them in the business outside of the product team. And I think it's just because life gets busy, really building that habit and sticking through the habit just doesn't end up happening. It always feels like some sort of luxury, which I know it's not, but I've never succeeded in getting it done at like a senior leadership level, let's say. Like, actually, let's just sit and reflect. Like a post-mortem of a lost deal or a customer that's struggling will happen, but not consistently over every action. And then also the ability to leave rank outside the door. That must take time to build, where, it's a little bit of like, okay, we're leaving rank outside. You need to then model it, but people must like kind of test the waters, say a slightly bad thing to the colonel in the room, and then see if there's retribution afterwards when you're back into the real world. And only over time, when you realize that your career has not been fundamentally killed or the retribution, because also the military, there's just loads of hazing, isn't there? So like, if none of that happens over time, presumably the lowest ranked person will say something about the highest ranked person, but it must take a while. Like, it's not just going to be on day one, because you have to model that trust over time. And in a business environment, I guess maybe because I've never seen retro stick as a real pattern, there hasn't been time to prove that everybody can handle hearing where they've gone wrong.
One interesting example that was massively successful at my last company was the OKRs and the cross-functional teams coming together, and those cross-functional teams doing retros once every 3 to 4 weeks. And we had the luxury of the product development team working with other stakeholders cross-functionally for each OKR that we had. And the lead person for those cross-functional teams was the product manager. So they were very intent on doing retros across the board for each of the cross-functional OKRs that we had set up. And what came out of those retros was fundamentally transformative to the company, where all the silos in the company that had been built up over time, this process of doing this broke it down, because they would sit there and cross-functionally, they would talk about how they were working together, sales, marketing, customer success, product development, on this kind of OKR basis. And the learnings that came out of it, we could showcase back to the rest of the company as to how we can work together, and real legitimate examples of how that happens.
But were those the only retros that were done consistently outside of the product team, or did other teams start to do retros as well?
We had retros at the leadership level and at the OKR cross-functional level, and that's as far as it went, to your point. So why don't we move on to our conversation with Andy and with Ben. Are you a COO, operations director, head of ops, or an aspiring operations leader? If so, Operations Nation, a global community for operations professionals, have got just the event for you this October. The only conference in Europe for ops leaders by ops leaders. They have an amazing program across 2 days filled with inspiring speakers, community-led roundtables, plenty of networking opportunities, and loads of fun lined up. It's on October 25th and 26th at Glaziers Hall in the heart of London. Register by going to operationsnation.com, and don't forget to enter the operations room at the checkout for an amazing 10% off the ticket price.
For those of you who'd like to meet me and Brandon, we're going to be there too. I'll be moderating a panel on how to convince VCs that ops is sexy, and Brandon and I will be running one of the roundtables. So come by and say hi. We can't wait to meet you. Once again, to register, go to operationsnation.com. That's operationsnation.com, and enter the operations room for your discount. See you there. In a business context, everybody thinks about, we don't want command and control. It equates to micromanagement. It's the old school, old-fashioned way of running businesses. And what we need is lots of empowerment and lots of agency within organizations. But I don't think we understand how the military works, because you can't actually micromanage in a mission. I think there's actually more subtlety to what command and control means in the real world.
When you get under the hood of military leadership, then you realize that command and control are two pieces of lexicon, but they are all about delegating down to the right level so that people can get the job done. If you exchange the words command and control for two civilian terms, let's say command is executed by the C-suite and control is executed by your middle management, then really they are doing very, very similar things. The C-suite is owning the mission, the vision, the strategy, the big picture. That's really what command is. They own the business and they're making the big calls. They are working with other agencies and coordinating them, moving their organization. Sometimes an oil tanker in a certain direction. They're allocating their assets in the right place at the right time. Control is much more down at that tactical level, right? The middle management. How are they taking all of those things, those resources, those missions, everything that's coming down out of the top, the command, and now going out and executing? They understand what they need to do. Now it's the day-to-day of getting the business done. And that's where you need to understand the vision, but you really need the flexibility to go and execute. All of that is founded on trust. And goodness me, since I've been in the software industry, I hear the T word a lot. Now, some people in the tech industry really don't understand that trust actually is the output of integrity. We can have that conversation if you like, but ultimately, the entire organization needs to have the trust that people are doing the right things at the right level. And so command and control, for me, it exists in a different form. We just don't use those two words.
So like you've just said, and the question of how you build trust, how you foster trust, how you create trust, and how you maintain it over time. Do you have any particular views on that, just in terms of how do you make that happen?
For me, it's a functioning of integrity. You can't say to somebody, trust me, and have them trust you. People trust you because of the way that you behave. And if your behavior is driven from a place of integrity, doing the right thing and looking after your people, your customers, and everything else, then trust will inevitably follow. But in terms of how does trust work, let's talk about the control word. If you're in a position of leadership and you're controlling a team in the military sense, but actually in the real world, as I said earlier, you're stewarding, caring for, looking after a team, serving a team as a leader, you have to provide trust without restriction. You have to give your team trust until they show you that they may not be worthy of it. But as the leader, you have to accept that your team are less likely to trust you until they get to know you. So it's your duty to earn their trust.
Last week's episode, we also talk about trust in the corporate environment in terms of trust is at an all-time low everywhere, not just like CEOs, government, press. And we were talking about how to build trust at scale, because a lot of it ends up being individual trust. So you build a rapport with somebody, you know, you can trust them, and then you hope to do that with lots of people. But when you do it at scale, it's not possible to rely on individual relationships for that. So she was talking about that you need to share the full story, the goods and the bads. And that's part of where people can trust you. Does that also happen in the military? So it's like the risk is really high that you're going to die, or you're going to kill lots of people, versus really low that you're going to die in this one. You know, what's the equivalent of the good news, bad news stories, and building trust rather than sugarcoating what might be happening?
I think some of the best leaders that I've ever had in the military have shared the bigger picture. I think giving you some level of visibility. And I've experienced this in my business where I've maybe overshared as well, said too much to the team, and actually some people can't deal with the reality of where we're at. Do you think leaders, Andy, are vulnerable give a level of vulnerability in the military? Because that's another thing around like visibility, vulnerability, bigger picture stuff.
In the military, we wear rank on our shoulders. And if you want to, you can use that rank to apply your authority. The best leaders that I have seen, from right down at the first enlisted NCO, non-commissioned rank, one rank above private, all the way up to 3 and 4 star generals. The best leaders that I've seen are those people who are, the word we use in civilian life all the time is authentic, and are vulnerable to an extent. It's challenging to show your full vulnerability in the military. It's a very male organisation, let's be frank here. But that has evolved over time. And I can tell you, I was privileged to work opposite the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States. Without a shadow of a doubt, he was an authentic, humble individual who naturally you wanted to gravitate towards. You did not see the 4 stars on his shoulder. You felt the warmth and the intelligence of that individual. And I've seen that all the way down through. So there's someone who's not relying on rank. I know for a fact that he would sit there with the team and he would listen to the most junior person in the room, and he would give them an opportunity to bring their ideas forward and show him where he was wrong. There was a great analogy, sort of a different scenario of a prime minister. And I knew somebody who worked in his operations room, the Cobra, and he would put out an idea and say, right, this is it. And then he would always say to his team, tell me why I'm wrong. It's a really simple statement, but he invited anybody in the room to shoot him down in flames. And I think really that comes down to setting psychological safety to allow it.
Well, it's interesting because you now just started psychological safety, so we're going to have to probe there. In the business world, there's a misunderstanding that it's about lots of niceties, no accountability. How can you hold people to account and yet still have it be a safe environment?
Psychological safety is the responsibility of a leader, and it's part of culture. If you are a great leader at any level and you can set that culture where people feel psychologically safe, where they can step forward and bring ideas and challenge you, and you don't take that with your ego, that's where you're getting a high-performing team. Again, I was really privileged in my very first tour, my very first flying squadron. I had a great boss, and I was the new kid on the block, the junior pilot, and I came in and I wasn't that good. Crikey, I think that's probably overstating the case. I was terrible. And, I was surrounded by a bunch of very, very high-performing professionals, some of whom have been flying these machines for a long time. And I remember in my early debriefs after a sortie, and every sortie has a debrief. You run through a plan, brief, execute, debrief cycle every single sortie that you fly in the military. I remember sitting in these debriefs surrounded by these people, and we'd sit down with my squadron commander who was 15, 20 years my senior, and there was no rank in the debrief. And people would say whatever had happened. And that's where, to your point about niceness, Beth, there's nothing nice about a fast jet debrief. The door gets closed and you better learn to have no ego, because when you come out, there's blood up the walls every single sortie. And that brutality is delivered with those underpinning principles Ben's talked about, right? Respect, loyalty, and it's all about how are we getting better every single day. It only works if you have psychological safety and you can step out the debrief, bruised and battered, and go and have a cup of tea and carry on and not having fallen out with people, and understand that this is all about us improving as a high-performing team.
Is there any tactics or how to do that for organizations that you would recommend?
I'm really pleased to hear you say what you can do and not what you can say. It's very easy to go in there and say, hey, there's psychological safety here. Okay, cool. If the first time somebody asks you a question in an open forum, you shoot them down in flames, they will never ask you a question again. If the first time that somebody challenges you quite or brings you an idea and you ignore them, then they'll stop bringing you ideas. And so I think really, again, it comes back to that integrity word I talked about. Is for me, whenever I meet a new team, I'll always say to them, I know I come across as a very confident person, sometimes a force majeure, because that's my military background. I know that. But I want you to know it's okay if you challenge me. I welcome it. I want you to tell me that I'm wrong, because that's how we're getting better. Okay, I've said that up front, but now how am I actually executing on that every single day? How am I listening to my team? And also, when I'm in a room full of big characters, how do I say, okay, everyone's had a word now except for you, the quiet person in the corner. What have you got for me? Because often that's where the best idea is coming from. And so I think it's just being mindful of it, whatever setting you're in, whether you're in the military or in the civilian world, whether you're in tech, whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in the financial services industry, it's being open and We hear a lot of that in terms of servant leadership or, or whatever label you want to stick on. The fact is that inclusivity and putting your money where your mouth is.
And when pressure's on, maintaining that position. I've had great leaders when we're not under pressure, but then when the pressure hits, it changes, their whole kind of ethos changes.
Psychologically, we all change under pressure, and being mindful of how you do is important. For me, often that means having somebody who is your closest confidant, right? And who's the person who's tapping you on the shoulder and going, hey, boss, actually, this isn't going well for you. Something I also always say to my team when I tell them about psychological safety, I'll always say, look, I'm open for an honest debate and for us to come up with the best solution together. At all times, I have the privilege of dropping the hammer and making the decision, but ultimately I want that decision to be something that we've formed together. We've brought all the ideas, and then it's on me to actually go, right, this is the direction we're going in, and everyone's planning in behind it. There is a time and a place to be authoritarian, to make that decision, to say, you know what, we're doing this because I say so. That is often in times of emergency. Something's gone really, really badly wrong and you don't have time to go through a slow process. It's, okay, give me your ideas really quickly. Okay, I don't have time to debate this. We're going that way. A really important point, though, about making the decision in that setting is understand that when you do, you break down trust. So if you make an authoritative decision at a point, it's then going to take you a long time to rebuild that trust. Better to have a bank account of trust where the team knows, okay, right, day in, day out, I'm doing the right things. I've built this trust with you by my actions, by my integrity. And when we get to that point of duress, if I make a decision and I have to say, hey, listen, there's no discussion, we're doing this because I say so, then they trust you enough to go, okay, right, we can pile in behind this and then we'll be back to operations as normal in due course.
If we go back to, it's all part of the same thing, being a good leader under stress, as much as being a good leader in the good times, requires a tremendous amount of self-regulation, as does leaving your ego at the door. Does the military help you learn how to self-regulate and leave the ego at the door? Or is it that people rise because they know how to do that themselves? And that's actually one of the critical skills needed as you go through, because it's a pyramid, isn't it? So there are a lot of people who don't go all the way to the top.
Hollywood does this quite well. It's one of those sort of instances that you know great leadership when you see it. You look at Tom Hanks's character in Saving Private Ryan, for example. Those people really do exist, and there are all sorts of other movies like it, and they can exist at any level. Again, from that lowest level on the battlefield where the rounds are flying and people are under extreme danger, and their friends may be dying around them. How do they react to that moment? All the way up to the top tier where there are high strategic stakes at play. Again, it's almost intangible. You know it when you see it, but generally, great leadership under duress begins with being calm, understanding what is my role here in this leadership position. For me, it's beautifully articulated by a friend of mine who is a 2-star US Army general. I had a similar conversation with her. She said to me that as a leader, you should only be doing the things that only you can do. And I think that's a really great ethos in terms of letting the team get on with it underneath you, staying calm in that difficult situation, and back to the trust word. You've built the trust, let them do it.
So how do you learn how to do that? So our listeners who are, maybe struggling with, they're not the most able to self-regulate, you can see that they change under pressure. What have you learned from the military?
For me, Beth, this isn't something that you're going to crack very quickly. One of the reasons that military folks are good under pressure is because they find themselves in situations that most humans don't find themselves in from a very early age. You work in high-stress environments. There is real danger on regular occasion, whether you're in training or whether you're on operations. And so you learn to get comfortable with risk and you learn to deal with fear. And Ben talks about the courage. But you learn what courage means, both in terms of physical courage, but also in terms of moral courage. We've already covered that off. But to answer your question, to help people to think about this, I'd say there are 3 things that you can do. The first thing I'd say is find that group of people around you, whether it's one person, but ideally a small group of people who will challenge you, and be prepared to listen to them. They don't necessarily have to be your colleagues or the team who work for you, but find those people around you who will challenge you, challenge your thinking, and make you see things the other way. The second thing I'd say is understand that you are going to make mistakes. If you listen to any high operating entrepreneur, CEO, they will all tell you that I made 1,000 mistakes before I got to success. There's that wonderful speech that Roger Federer made just recently about the number of points he lost versus the number of points that he won. and all the mistakes he made, but what he was really good at was putting the mistake behind him. And that's something certainly I learned in my fast jet debriefs was, okay, mistake made, put it behind me. What am I learning from it? And that's the key is that you are learning. And that's the third point. When you are making mistakes and when you are in those high pressure situations, if you can forgive yourself for making a mistake, but take the lesson from it, then you will become better and better and better. And you will understand when you've seen more scenarios, okay, I've seen something like this before, or I've been in a situation that's worse than this before. My job here is to stay calm, think clearly, seek counsel, do my best.
The best thing that I ever did is get mentors. And it wasn't intentional. It was, I have maybe 5 people who I regularly meet up with, and they're doing it just for conversations. Hopefully, like, they get something out of the conversation with me as well. But the sounding board of people who have been there and done it, like, for me, is irreplaceable. I wouldn't be where I'm at right now if I wouldn't have had those kind of an Andy Wright or a Karen Gallantry. I'm meeting her today for 2 hours to talk about traction. I've got amazing people now in the organization, but actually people who aren't in it, in the thick of it day to day, who aren't emotionally tied to it, I think for me has been the most important thing since I started the business.
So on a different topic, training and development, when I think about the military, I think about a tremendous amount of training and a tremendous amount of development over time. And when you look at scale-up companies specifically, it's usually pretty scattershot. There's just not a tremendous amount of time to invest in people to get them trained up in different respects. And I say that not in a flippant way, because I know that in the scale-ups that I've worked in, we've done our best, I would say, in terms of trying to onboard people effectively, in particular, trying to ensure that SDRs, BDRs, when they come in, or AEs, they're trained effectively to ensure they can sell the product usefully. The rest of the organization, typically, it's not great, I would say, for the most part. And I'm just wondering, from a scale-up standpoint, are we missing a trick here?
In the military, we think about training and education separately, and then development is almost a third arm, really. Training for me is related to technical expertise, doing the things that make you good at your specific job. For me, that was learning how to fly an airplane, doing things with my hands, flipping switches, understanding how to operate the airplane. That's all about training. And you might do that as an individual, flying my single airplane, or you might do that collectively with a whole bunch of other airplanes on a huge exercise. Okay, that's good. That makes you an expert in what you do specifically as a role. But now, how do I fit in the wider organization? How do I take that machine, that tank, that ship, that weapon system into the field and operate in a larger, even national or even international setting? And that really comes to education. What I need to do is increase my education so I understand what I do within it. And that is where you become a professional master, where you understand your role in the business. Now, if you think about that now, development to me means you as an individual, how am I growing in all sorts of different ways? Or how am I developing my entire organization? Now, coming back to your point, Brandon, at a small startup capability, it's very, very easy to be the professional master. If there's only 15 of you, you probably know everybody in the organization. You can see, okay, this is my role within it. So really, probably you want to focus more on the professional expertise. How are you trained enough to do your job that fits from the organization? That includes the founder and the CEO. Because they have a job to do as they start, and they need to be technically efficient at it. But as the organization gets bigger and bigger, those roles evolve, right? And so that's where you need to understand, right, we've got to educate our people in terms of they're going to have to start thinking differently. They're going to have to understand as the organization grows, we have to educate them so that they still are operating in their role within it. And separately, they are developing themselves.
To me, an AE is coming in with a certain level of baseline, I assume, coming into the business. But the best business I've worked for outside of the military has had a learning culture. But in the military, you're given the baseline, and then you're continually, as Andy says, developing over time. That learning agility is there because you're on courses, you're going on leadership courses, you do 12 years of learning different things, new aircraft, new systems, you're constantly doing it. Ultimately, are they in an environment where they can continuously learn and they're being encouraged to learn and get better? Being given the time to do that as well. I've been in an organization where you don't get any time to self-develop. You're just at it. It's all about numbers, activity. We're talking about sales now, but what are your dials? How many meetings are you having each week?
If our listeners can only take away one thing from the conversation today, what is it?
Respect is earned. And I think the best leaders I've ever met gain your respect from being good people and having that humility and looking after the people that they lead, like servant leaders.
I'd echo Ben's comments in terms of humility, and I think that Ben's talked about that at the human level, but also at the learning level. For me, we've talked about this today. Make the mistakes, have the humility to understand that you've made a mistake and say, look, we got this wrong. Great example was the CrowdStrike CTO came out and said, hey, look, we made a mistake here. We do great things all the time, and we've got this wrong, and it's had a massive impact, and we're sorry about that. Right? That's humility. But for me, humility also falls under that overriding umbrella that we talked about right at the beginning. And this is the takeaway I'd like is that's integrity. If you are going out there every single day as a leader or as an aspirant leader, and you are conducting yourself with integrity, then trust will come. You will naturally be humble, and you will create that environment where people want to go out, as Ben says, run through brick walls for you, do the right things, and you will nurture a high performance environment.
So on that note, I will wrap us up very humbly here, which is thank you, Ben. Thank you, Andy, for joining us on the operations room. If you like what you hear, please subscribe or leave us a comment, and we will see you next week.